No. Okay, we'll wait one more minute for additional attendees to arrive, and then we'll get started. We do have a quorum at this point. All right, I do have 10:01. We have a quorum present. So good morning. This open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is being conducted remotely pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021 and is being held by video conference. Please note this meeting is being recorded and all attendees are participating via Zoom as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. All supporting materials that have been provided to members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. Please be aware that other people may be able to see you and take care not to share your device's screen. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Please silence all phones and devices. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full names for Zoom access. If the full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. I'm Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Gary Beller.
Present.
Sarah Boyce.
Present.
Peter Brace.
Present.
Ian Golding.
Here.
Dan Carberg.
Here.
Fritz McClure.
Here.
Joanna Roach.
Here.
And I do not see Matt Fee yet. He may join us. Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Vince Murphy.
Here.
And Morgan Sale.
Here.
Thank you. Anticipated speakers on the agenda. Sheila Lucy has informed us that she is not able to attend today, and Vince has a message from her when we get to that item on the agenda. Other than that, Vince is the anticipated speaker for many of the items on the agenda today. Before we turn to the first item on the agenda, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and ensure accurate meeting minutes. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the list of members, inviting each by name to provide comments, questions, or or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute yourself on your phone or computer when you're not speaking. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. If you're not able to participate in the remote meeting, you may also submit comments to the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, Vince Murphy, to be read into the meeting record. His email is vmurphy@nantucket-ma.gov. And finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. All right, we have on the agenda, first item is our storm update from Vince Murphy and Morgan Sale.
Thanks, Mary. I'm just going to share screens and get into presentation mode. I got to move a couple of things around. Just bear with me now. Hopefully people can see this coming up.
Yes, we are seeing PowerPoint.
Yeah, and I got to get my people on one screen. There we go. Okay. Either Mary or Peter or Morgan, you're all co-hosts. If you could keep an eye on the participants to admit people while I'm speaking, if that's okay, please.
Of course. So we're seeing the PowerPoint with the slides down this. There we go.
There we go. So just going to give an update on Winter Storm Keenan. I'm going to cover the flooding part of it. Morgan is going to cover the erosion part of it. And I'm just going to admit Joyce. Okay, thank you. And I have to again thank Morgan for upping the ante on the graphics and making it look like a really nice presentation. Credit goes to her on this. I just supplied pictures and she made it look brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to cover the flooding portion of it. Hopefully people can see the intersection here of Easton Street. That was nicely flooded. And as you can see, at the bottom of Broad Street, looking down towards Steamboat Wharf, there was also flooding pretty much up as far as the door of Stubby's.
Vince, while you're pausing there, I'll note Matt Fee has joined the meeting.
Okay. Good to go?
Yep.
I had a walk around the rest of the downtown area, and just so that everyone can see on the top left here, this is Oak Street looking down the side of the Dreamland. You can see where there's open water, but I was standing in water because the ice got blown up that street as well. So there's standing harbour water underneath the ice to pretty much where where I was standing when this picture was taken. And then in the right-hand side, the right-hand picture at the bottom of Main Street heading for Straight Wharf, that area, you can see there's standing water going down Straight Wharf. Having a little look at the car park in Wilkes Square, there was harbour water flowing up this area, but it was passable. And then you can see the front door of the Salem Street Stop and Shop. There was also water flowing in this area as well. I went back around to have another better look and at Easy Street area and get a better understanding of it. The picture on the left is the overview where you can see the edge of where the water got up to. High tide was at 9:30. It was supposed to be at 9:04, thereabouts, and the water continued to rise until 9:38. I was in this area around 9:36 and before it. So I was there just before the peak. And on the right-hand side, you can see splash over coming from the harbour, going straight onto benches. The benches were somewhat free moving. I got to go around Oak Street again. I didn't walk down Easy Street. I went around the other way. And there's two side-by-side pictures here just for comparison. There's the one on the left that I took from the opposite corner of where the Dreamland looks onto Easy Street on Oak Street, looking onto the wall here. Hopefully people can see my cursor. This is the town's portion of the wall, and from right about there is the Land Bank's portion of the wall. Same difference in the picture here, taken from a Facebook post by Jason Graziade, where you can see it from kind of an upper oblique angle looking down. And this was also around the peak tide. There's one thing that's worth noting in this. While I was standing looking at this area, it was snowing. It's not the best picture in the world, but I tried to zoom in as best I could to get an idea of the Land Bank tide markers, storm tide markers. Hopefully people can see the cursor here. Where the cursor is going across the screen is the topmost marker. There's only 3 or 4 visible below it. It seems like it was a storm of record. So that's just something to note. And I do apologize for the quality of the photo. I didn't have sufficient waders to go over that far in the wind and driving sleet. It was a pretty bad flood event. It was, was it 6.56 feet, I think was the actual number, above mean lower low water, which is what Chuck has been using to measure. We had about 3 feet extra water, basically.
Vince, do we know if this storm was classified, as a 20-year storm, 50-year storm, 100-year storm? When is that designation made?
I don't know. I don't know that information yet. It typically is the kind of thing that gets put on the NOAA website. It could take some time. So what they do is they put out a predicted storm and a preliminary results. It could take up to a year before they put out confirmed results.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so everyone knows that these are just some of the pictures from the flooding. This will be relevant when I talk about stuff in the next section, once we get talking about the MCFRM. And I'm going to turn this over to Morgan now for the erosion part of the storm update.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Morgan.
Okay, everything looks good?
Not quite. I'm seeing a black screen.
There should be some text on it. How about, is
There
this
it is.
good? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Yes, so as Vince was saying, this was a pretty significant storm. There was a lot of wind with this one, gusts up to 70 miles an hour, mostly out of the north, but I think it moved around a little bit between northeast and northwest. We were pretty lucky with this storm. There were not really any severe erosion impacts. The North Shore was hit the hardest. There was some very minor localized erosion to some areas of the South Shore that were generally about a foot or less in most spots. But it was definitely not hit quite as hard as the storm from MLK weekend. And this is pretty obvious, but when winds come out of different directions, it hits different parts of the island differently. So the last storm we had mostly came out of the south and the southwest. This storm was out of the north. So that's why we saw most impacts from the North Shore. All right. Here's a little weather overview. You can see the wind direction. There was a lot of rainfall with this storm too, and snow. We also had a sign wash up from Chatham, which I thought was interesting. And I think part of it's hard to tell if it was our town pier or their town pier, but nearby was a pier. This was on, I think, kind of on the West Tristram area of the North Shore. Here is a great photo. This is pretty much what it looked like all along the North Shore. The top of the coastal bank did not really move, but as you can see, the face of the bank was pretty destabilized. There was a lot of this big chunks of clay and dirt coming out of the bank. Here's another great photo. Here's showing all that nice clay. As you can see, it's kind of about halfway up, but the top of the bank really is generally in the same place, which is nice. Here's some damage to some stairs. There's some pretty significant undercutting right here on the photo on the right. But it really just gives you a pretty good picture of what that looks like. Here is Dionis. It looks like the kind of eastern side of Dionis maybe did lose a little bit off the top of the bank. You can see some of that vegetation that slid down and is kind of slumped, piled up at the bottom. And then the view looking west towards Eel Point, the photo on the right, is kind of how we were seeing in the other photos, where it's mostly just the face of the bank that seemed to lose some sand. Here is the South Shore. South Shore generally looks the same. There was a couple, like I said, like a couple spots that maybe lost about a foot or less, but for the most part, it actually looked pretty good. Here's Fisherman's Beach on the left looking west, and we have a photo from the sewer beds looking east on the right. Here is a photo of the eastern side of the island around the Squam area looking north towards Wauwinet. You can see that there was some sand taken from the beach. It's kind of laying a little bit lower, but this seems to be pretty typical of what happens in the winter. Sand gets taken out and then it comes back later on. Then we have some minor localized erosion to the top of the Sconset Bluff. Generally, this area was like all the others. The top of the bank stayed in the same place, but there was a few places on the face of the bank that some sand was lost, and a few spots where a little bit of the top of the bank did move. I believe this is south of the geotube. Here we have the sand delivery access point. The photo on the left was taken before the storm, and the photo on the right was taken after. So the access ramp is pretty much gone. But again, a lot of this sand that's lost is really only to the face of the bank. So we were pretty lucky in terms of that. It's a pretty short presentation. In conclusion, this could have been a lot worse. We were pretty fortunate, but we'll see how things continue. So that's my update.
Thank you, Morgan. Vince, anything you wanted to add? I know we had some additional information from one of the members. So we can put it him, unless you want to.
Morgan just need to mute. Thank you. We share an office, so we have to play the whose turn is it to mute game. Ian sent an email yesterday with information that he asked me to forward that I sent around to all the committee. It showed the drone photographs from a drone that showed the something similar to Morgan's second photograph, where sand was taken away from the face of the bank, but it kind of goes along the geotubes and shows what that area looks like post-storm. If Ian wants to summarize it and how he sees it, and that would be useful. If not, fine.
Yeah, Ian, did you want us to display the photos, or what did you want?
Would you please? They were forwarded by Deanne, as I think I mentioned, and Spruce took the pictures. And
Burton Balkind, yes, thank you.
and sort of pretty self-evident. So thank you. But if you could display them on the screen for the public, that would be great. Thank you, Vince.
All right. People see this?
Yes.
Okay.
So Ian, do you want to tell us about these?
This is the south end of the geotubes. And, you know, there's really nothing to add. Do you have the next one, Vince? Yeah, so that's the middle of the geotubes. And then that's roughly at 101 Baxter Road there in the north. And it's sort of the normal end scar from these storms. So.
If you bear with me one moment, Ian, I'll put up the other ones.
Sure.
I just have to change one moment. You got that?
And then here you have the Quarro Rays to the south. And so I think that's a good example of what happens when you don't have any protection of the toe. You can see where it's starting to slump there. Yeah. So I think, as Morgan was saying, we got off lightly there, or Baxter Road got off lightly this time around.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those. Again, credit to Burton Balkind, the photographer, who sent them to Concom, and Ian is our Concom representative, so he's forwarded them to us. Any other questions or comments from members about the storm? Peter?
Yeah, I'd kind of add to what Ian was saying. The photos that Morgan showed us on the North Shore, and then of course on the East Shore, and saying that we got off light. I guess erosion is the gift that keeps on giving. So the beach, the banks got munched away at the bottom, but eventually the banks are going to seek the angle of repose. So even though they didn't erode at the top during the storm, eventually they're going to set backwards as things slump down. So it's not a done deal when the storm is over. And also the photos that Spruce shot, just notice if you notice that how close the water is to the geotubes, and then how close it is to the shores that aren't protected. That's important. Okay.
Other comments or questions from members? Vince, at one point, I think in the last meeting, you said you're going to be establishing more erosion stations, monitoring stations. Any progress or anything else on that?
No, we're still trying to identify some more. Part of the key is to make sure it's town property, or that we have the correct permissions to put it on the people's land. But also, we've had quite a busy couple of weeks between storms and trying to get grant applications off the ground, that kind of stuff. I'll get to that in the rest of the report. It's been a busy few weeks. I haven't gotten to it.
Yeah. Gary?
I just have a question for Vince. What intersection was the one that showed Easton Street flooding, the first slide? Easton Street and what? Was that North Beach or what?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was kind of looking towards where Great Point Realty is. So I was looking straight.
I'm interested in that because the planning board is meeting again on someone who is proposing a swimming pool about 50 feet north, 50 feet north of where that flooding is, which always boggles my mind when I think about swimming pools in that flood zone, but thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Further comments or questions on the storm update? Vince, if you want to go ahead and put that agenda up on the screen. We'll move on to the next item, and you can tell us what Sheila Lucy, the harbor master, told you.
Sheila had agreed to come today, and she was all ready for it. And I got a call about, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes before the start of this meeting. And she was desperately sorry that she couldn't attend today. She wanted to send apologies to the committee members. But hopefully people will excuse her, because the surveyors that were supposed to come tomorrow to look at the town pier came today. So she has a very good reason for not being here. So she wanted me to say that the pier, damage to the pier is repairable. She wanted to make that point very clear. And they don't know yet if the money to repair the pier is going to come from insurance or from another appropriation. And she assured me that the pier is going to be back in operation for the summer boating season. Actually, she said for the boating season, she didn't say summer.
Thank you, Vince. Good to know that there wasn't severe damage there. Sarah?
I was just wondering if there's an opportunity to reschedule with Sheila, or if you guys talked about it. I know it was probably a last minute thing with the surveyors changing their plans, but because I think it would be great to have her similar to when she gave a talk at the State of the Harbor and last year, and just hearing some more about the plans for the town pier and the building, and and the opportunity for us to ask questions. So I would love to have that rescheduled.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll definitely try and reschedule that. Other comments or questions? Okay, so the remainder of the agenda, we have Vince talking about I'm sorry, before we get to Vince, we have the discussion that we're going to begin today. It's definitely not going to conclude today, about the recommendation from the Coastal Resilience Plan to update our benchmark data from the NOAA sea level rise predictions to the Massachusetts more localized. And Vince has some information about that. I think that the key here is to remember we want the best available data, and both the word best and the word available are subject to some conditions. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but this is to begin the discussion of updating our recommendation, exactly what we would change it to if we are going to change it. So Vince, if you want to kick that off.
Thank you, Mary. That's the end of the last presentation. So on we go to the next one. Okay, this is being slow. Are people seeing this?
Seeing the storm.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry, it was my computer is having an issue. All right, it should be in presentation mode now.
Yes.
So I just want to go over some of the differences between the NOAA data that people have been looking at for the last couple of years, have come to understand and have experience with, quite frankly. And I want to try and show what the MCR FRM is capable of, its advantages, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, some disadvantages that we're going to have to try and see if we can overcome, or how we're going to get around it, or if it is even possible. I don't know yet, to be frankly honest. But to kind of get everyone on the same footing, and for members of the public and people that might be watching the recording later, I'm just going to go over the history of the NOAA first and how we came to be at that point. So CRAC drafted a recommendation for sea level rise while we were preparing the Coastal Resilience Plan, while it was still in development. And it was to use the NOAA high scenario for planning purposes, and that has an end number of 9.25 feet by 2100, and that's over the sea level as it was in the year 2000. It was accepted by the Select Board on August 5th, 2020, and it says in its 2-page summation that it would be superseded by design flood elevations in the CRP. So then the MCFRM, which stands for Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, is the recommended sea level rise package from the Coast Resilience Plan. And in the Coast Resilience Plan, strategy 114 from the CRP has the title, Update Locally Adopted Sea Level Rise Scenarios and Best Available Flood Hazard Data. And it has the description, adapt sea level rise scenarios provided by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model as the best available flood hazard data. And the first word is adopt, not adapt. So the DFE recommendations in the CRP are based on the MCFRM. And I had to put it in at the end, TLA overload, 3-letter acronyms everywhere. Sorry, guys. If anyone has any questions on the 3-letter acronyms, please stop me. Because that's the last sentence. If I could write a more government sentence, I don't know if I could today. So yeah, the design flood elevations recommended in the Coast Resilience Plan are based on the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model. So that's one of the reasons why we have to look at changing to that potentially. So I just want to kind of do somewhat of a side-by-side comparison of the NOAA and the MCFRM, and then show examples of both and what they're able to do and their limitations in the next couple of slides. So NOAA data, the NOAA sea level rise data, federally published, it gets updated approximately every 5 to 7 years. It was last published in 2017. The previous update before that was 2013. It's based on information in a paper written by Sweet et al. That came out in 2017. And it accompanied the new map that came out, the map that I've shown here many times and have excerpts from again today. And it addresses sea level rise nationwide and uses broad assumptions to fit the whole country. I'm going to put this on the town website afterwards. There's links at the bottom if you want to go find the original report from Sweet et al. From 97. The MCRFM, by comparison, is published by the state through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, Mass DOT. So we don't know what the scheduling update cycle is going to be like, if it's going to be annual every 5 years or what it's going to be. We don't know that just yet. So that's something worth knowing at this committee level. It's based on information that was undertaken by UMass Amherst in 2018, the Massachusetts Climate Change Projections Report. There's a link at the bottom here for everyone that people can look at afterwards if they choose. And it began in 2019 and is still being worked on and still being updated. I have a tiny bit more to say about that later. And it's more specific to Massachusetts. It's more localized and it uses different data sources, but it changes the assumptions specifically for our state. So the way that the NOAA works, it's something that came up 2 years ago or more when we were trying to explain it and trying to have people understand the NOAA information, that they use the bathtub approach. Basically, water rises evenly and it assumes water is flat. It's also at a very much lower resolution. It's kind of originally intended for kind of street and small neighborhood decision-making type things. The MCFRM uses very different bases. It doesn't use the bathtub approach, it uses dynamic modeling. So it uses waves, wind, and run up, so the depth of the water as a wave approaches a piece of land to understand how it might break, are taken into account, as well as tides, storm surge, overtopping, current flood corridors, very similar, but tiny bit different from storm tide pathways. I spent an hour trying to understand the difference yesterday. Apparently there's a nuance of a difference, but for the sake of argument, we could take that as something similar to storm tide pathways, and also includes storm impacts like hurricanes and nor'easters. The simplest way I can break this down is quite simply, this is sea level rise plus waves and storms. If that's not too blunt of a way of putting it, that's how I've tried to work it out in my head, as kind of the difference between the NOAA. NOAA just is a bathtub that rises evenly everywhere. And the MCFRM is sea level rise with other elements included like waves and storms. And it's also at a much, much higher resolution. I'm going to show some images of resolution that, later on. it broke in populated areas. It's broken up to a resolution of every 10 feet. And it's specific enough to be to see individual building scale or finer. So in coming up with these comparisons to see the difference between them, I quickly learned that it was difficult to directly compare them as the approaches are significantly, and the sensitivities are so different. The MCRFM is just higher resolution and better in so many other ways. So, and what does the data look like? We're used to looking at the NOAA data. So just to kind of compare it, NOAA, we're used to it. It talks about 6 scenarios from low to extreme and does 3 timeframes that I've talked about. Oh, that's a typo. 2030, 2050, and 2100, not 2010. Apologies. I'll correct that for the final version if nobody minds. Whereas the the Massachusetts climate change projections are the base for the MCFRM, but the MCFRM uses selected data from the climate change projections. So the climate change projections for the state uses 4 scenarios and 4 timeframes. So having less scenarios is a bit of a conceit, but it's kind of the same from inter through to extreme. They did that for a reason, and that I'll have to explain in my very last slide. It's based on carbon emissions and how they make the assumption that we're not going to go down in our carbon emissions. So they basically ruled out the lower ones. And it's got greater sensitivity looking at more timeframes in their scenario. But when it comes to how that was applied to the MCFRM, it's hard to say that the MCFRM uses scenarios. It's like one scenario with projections built into it, where there's more like a maximum, a minimum, and then like a mean, an arithmetic mean is put in, and that's somewhat similar to the percentages that they put in. It's how they ended up deriving the probabilities that are in their graphs. But at the moment, I only have 3 timeframes: the present, what flooding currently looks like in a storm for the sake of argument, at 2050 and 2070. I'm awaiting 2100 for Nantucket. So from NOAA, we're used to this graph. This is actually directly from the August 2020 CRAC recommendation. The 0 point in this is something we have to take account of at this point. It's local mean sea level as it was in the year 2000. There's a very important difference in this in a second. It's minor, but it's important. And we're used to the high scenario going for 9.25 feet for 2100. And we've also seen this graph a number of times. It's got meters of sea level rise on the left-hand axis. So I just put in the raw feet numbers for each scenario on the right-hand side so that people could understand it and see it in a more useful term that people see every day. So we're always talking about this pinkish line here, the high scenario, 9.25 feet. That's right in there. I just want to see kind of in a somewhat side-by-side comparison what was there for these two, that table and this graph for MCFRM. So in MCFRM, they've got their 4 scenarios and 4 timeframes in here, from intermediate through to extreme. The big difference that I need to point out is that they use NAVD 88 as it was in the year 2000 as their baseline. But their NAVD 88 it's not a set level. It's a datum that you use to calculate levels from. So the nearest that I can explain it is that in the year 2000, NAVD 88 was a few inches above mean low water. That is extremely crude way of putting it. And there's error in that because it only would make sense on Easy Street. And once you start moving to other parts of the island, NAVD 88 moves with it, and it doesn't make any sense to Easy Street anymore. So as you move away, it has to be recalculated for a lot of different positions, is what I'm trying to say. So the other thing that I want to point out in this table is the RCP 8.5 right in here in this box. I've got to explain this, and I'm going to explain this in the very last slide. This is basically one of the highest carbon emission scenarios that they're using. Basically, they're assuming we're not going to change our current carbon emission trajectory. There's 2 others that they use in the Massachusetts Climate Projection Report. Sorry, there's one other, it's 4.5. And that assumes that we would top out our carbon emissions around mid-century from 2040 on, and then we'd taper off or have about the same amount of carbon emissions for the rest of the century. I have a graph later to explain that. So, but you can see here, what you really need to see is for the high scenario, instead of 9.25 feet, it's 7.9 feet, call it 8 feet for the sake of argument, for 2100. And this is more localized to Nantucket. It's specifically derived for Nantucket again, the same way that the NOAA was, but using much more localized conditions.
Vince, if I can just ask a quick question. So again, we're looking with the Massachusetts projection at sea level plus waves plus storms is 7.9 feet?
For this, yes, correct.
So that would compare to NOAA high scenario 2100, 9.25 sea level only. That's
what they've calculated, correct.
Okay, thank you.
There's a nuance to this that's why I had to put so much information on slides, and this is where it's going to be shared out with everyone afterwards, because this is dense. I appreciate that. And then for the projections, this is taken directly from the state's publication. I thought about remaking this graph and adding trend lines, adding the same kind of projection lines to it, but this is their base data, so I didn't want to mess with it too much. And you can see it topping out for the high scenario, this medium blue. I'm not an artist, not the dark blue, but the one below it, just below 7.9 feet. Sorry, just below 8 feet at 7.9 feet. So this is just like in the NOAA graph, this is the experienced experienced sea level rise. And then this is what we could see between now and the end of the century for each scenario. Okay, so I just want to show people what the information looks like now. Show you the familiar first from NOAA, and then show you the update, the MCFRM data. So everyone's kind of used to this. One thing that I have a problem with, and always have had a problem with the NOAA data, is I can only do it in 1 foot increments. And even when you get the downloadable version, you can put into ArcGIS, it still only allows you the 1 foot increments. So I can't land exactly on 2050, but I can land close enough to where water might be in 2050. So there is, it's as close as I can get, and that's just the way that this particular model works. And so the high scenario for 2050, about 3 feet of sea level rise is what they're expecting here. So then for 2070 approximately, I picked these dates to match up with the MCFRM, not for any other reason than that, just so people know 2050 and 2070 are what I have information for, so I'm trying to get the comparable in here. It shows more of the downtown and Brand Point area flooded at high tide. So let's see what MCFRM looks like for about the same. It's in a color chart. I've changed the transparency in this just so that it wouldn't be all black, so you'd have recognizable features underneath it. But basically there's this 100% chance, which is any of the darkest areas, and then you go through 50, 30 and so on various gradations of percentage chance of being flooded for these time periods. And this is present day, just so everyone knows. This is what they show first, present day, before they show 2050 and 2070. So this is this is present day, and then 2050 probability of flooding and 2070. So this is quite nice, and it's at about roughly the same bird's eye view as the previous one, but MCFRM has differences. We can go right in and look at a localized area. I just picked Children's Beach. I've got a good number of these examples to kind of show. And here, these little wavy parts in the lines, that kind of comes down to the 10-foot increments that you can see. So that you can see anything in black is okay, and anything, is the 100% chance of flooding, which is what we're used to seeing. And then this kind of darker blue here is getting into the 50 percentile chance of flooding. I've seen this flood quite regularly recently. And then just to move in again, I picked the town finance department for no good reason, other than that they had a number of different shadings across their building. This is quite literally the building outline. And if you want, I can zoom in to the point where I can see this symbol on the road, on the parking lot much more clearly. We can do an awful lot more. For the previous versions for NOAA, I was as zoomed in as I could get. That was as close as it would do. For these, I can go right into a building, look at the various flooding scenarios for the building. So we know that the front of the building is in the 50th percentile flooding area, and then so on down to the 25th, down to the 10th and so on for the back of the building. We just know the risks much more clearly. I also wanted to show you how it might work at the neighborhood scale, just because we still can do it. We don't have to go look at every single building. So this is pretty much the whole length of Broad Street going down to Steamboat Wharf down here. So this is present day flooding. And I just kind of wanted to show how this matches up for what we expect. This is the 100% flood area. And from last weekend, this is basically what I saw flood marked up in red, just so that we know that it happened. But we actually got into some of the 50th percentile flooding areas in this most recent storm, but I'm just showing that in the 100% flooding area, we already saw that. And then let's move on to 2050, I beg your pardon, and 2070. And you can see that the town building right here in the middle basically gets into the edge of it gets into the 100% flood zone, and you're going to see higher potential moving up Broad Street. But once you get into these kind of little numbers here, these red bands, yellow and so on, you're into such diminishing small probabilities. It is hard to imagine it. I was trying to chat with Graham Durovich yesterday to try and explain it to her. And I said, it's not a good analogy. To explain to people, but one thing you could do is say that the 1% is a 100-year storm. The 5%, the 2% then is a 500-year storm. And the 1%, the 0.1% is the equivalent of a 1,000-year storm. It's not the best analogy to use, but just so people can wrap their head around it at an early stage, that is one of the nicer ways to explain it.
So red is actually a sort of a low danger marker on this color scale, and the blue and the purple is the greater danger.
Yeah, I'd basically be looking at the black and the blues, and once you get below the 25th percentile, you're into much diminishing probabilities at that point. So yeah, but I'm just going to cycle back through it so people can see it again. Present day through 2050 and 2070. I'm still waiting on 2100. I also looked at another area just so that people could see it and understand the risk over time. This is the kind of Wilkes Square area. This is present day. And in the most recent storm, we saw that the 100 percentile area and the 50 percentile area pretty much is what got water in last weekend. Or sorry, the weekend before, I beg your pardon. But as we cycle through 2050, we see that most of Wilkes Square ends up in the 100 percentile area. And then 2070, you're up to Union Street pretty much. So I just want to talk about some of the advantages, but also the disadvantages. So obviously it's more recent than NOAA. It's more locally applicable. It's to a much, much higher resolution. And I have to say this, we have permission to use it for planning purposes. Here's where I'm going to run into the disadvantages. So if we're doing a building development for the town, for the sake of argument, we can use it. Is it ready to be used by private individuals yet? I don't know that it is. It's something that I don't know that we can even put on the town website yet. I don't know what permissions I might have to get to do that, but that's something I'd like to check out in detail. So it's not available to the public. I need to have ArcGIS, and I need to have a specific program to use it, and it's not a cheap program either. The town has the program, it has 5 seats at it. I'm one of the 5 people in the town that can use this. So that's just the way that we have. If we wanted to expand that for other town employees to use it, I don't know what that expense would be, but just raising that as a question. How how would we get it on the town GIS system? Could the town GIS system handle something so powerful? I don't know. This is the kind of questions that I'm raising at this early point, and how we're going to try and move forward with this. And I'd probably also need to get permission from the State Department of Transportation if I was to see about putting it on that town website just yet. So that's one big disadvantage to it. NOAA, perfectly publicly available. MCFRM, no, not yet. I'm sorry to say, I just want everyone to understand that, and it's something that we have to know about at this early stage. But there's other things to make note about the MCFRM. In grant applications, the state is developing a preference for applications that use MCFRM. Then in the next couple of years, I can imagine that it'll be a requirement. So getting it in at this early stage would put us ahead of the curve again. And I just want to finish with something I said earlier on. The easiest way to think about it is sea level rise plus wave action plus storms is all going into the probability scores that I showed on screen today. And just the last slide here is to try and explain the representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. This is in the state information, they basically use 4.5 and 8.5. I also just kind of wanted to point out that there's kind of a middle ground as well. That is RPC 6, and there's actually an RPC 7 as well that's more relevant to climate management from, what's that called again? The UN. But basically, these scenarios that I presented today are all based on the idea that there's just going to be no change in the current trajectory, and we're just going to continue to put out carbon emissions in particular at the same way we are doing today at an exponential rate through the end of the century. But if we were to get lucky and manage to reduce our carbon emissions in either RPC 4.5 or 6, which would mean tailing off and peaking in around the mid-century or 2080 kind of time frame, then that would be ideal, and we could see our risk significantly reduced. Everybody knows this already. Everyone's talking about the next 5-10 years being the threshold to turn carbon emissions around. That is going to be huge. And I had a chat with someone in the office here yesterday. Nantucket's carbon footprint is immense compared to cities like Boston, but only once you break it down to the per individual scale. So that's just something to bear in mind. I can fully appreciate that this is dense, heavy material. And I can imagine people have a lot of questions. So just so you know, I can answer some questions, but not everything. I'm hoping to get someone from the state, hopefully, to come and explain this in more detail in the next, at an upcoming CRAC meeting. I don't know when.
Thank you, Vince. Questions or comments from committee members? Jen, and then Sarah, and then Peter.
Thank you, Mary. Vince, I wonder, is it possible, since Arcadis was kind of the group that suggested we started building this into what's happening with the CRP, is there a possibility to have them explain to us how we could use it as a town? Because as I look at it, you know, the NOAA projections are so easy to, all right, this is the number at this year, plan your buildings this way. But looking at the percentage of possibilities of flooding, we probably have to look at a more detailed recommendation, or figuring out how to adapt that for an actually useful recommendation for putting projects on properties. You know, are we telling people to just use it and figure it out for themselves? Or are we going to figure out guidelines for, in this year at this percentage of flooding, this is what you should pay attention to? I just wonder if either, you know, Arcadis and or Trevor and staff have suggestions on how a town can use it, or if other towns have kind of figured out how to put this in regulations yet.
Thanks, Jen. That's kind of my thinking, is that our recommendation is about to get a lot more complicated. We can't just swap out one set of numbers for another, that there needs to be some more assistance to the public in how to use them. Sarah, I know you have a comment, and we'll go to Matt and then to Ian. I'm sorry, Sarah, then Peter, then Matt, then Ian.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think Jen asked the question in a very positive way. I was thinking, you know, I wouldn't want us to change our recommendation at this point when even we know localized data is better, right? Because we're talking about our island and what's happening here. But the NOAA data is publicly available to everyone. And if we remember from our earlier discussions when we made the recommendation, that part of it was that it was regularly updated. And there's, you know, links to regular updating. And so it was continuously publicly available, both in the visual sense of just the mapper that we can all look at, and then the data are publicly available. And so I think there can be, it's always best to use the best data, but if these data are like proprietary, it sounds like to some extent, or at least, inaccessible to majority of the public, then I don't think that we can use that as a recommendation. I think that it's great that, Vince, you're doing this work now to kind of lay the groundwork for the future. But if the state is going to require this for grants, they're going to have to make it publicly available or more usable. So I think we're kind of laying the groundwork for that point. But I just, that's my 2 cents, only because I'm going to have to leave at 11. I want to say, I don't think we should change anything now when it's not available.
So just to confirm, this is the beginning of the discussion. We are not expecting to take a vote today or to write a new recommendation today. This is just the beginning. But thank you, Sarah, for the comments. I'm imagining that we may need to bifurcate our recommendation and produce a different recommendation for the town and for the public. But we'll discuss all of that in the future. Peter?
Muted. Peter's muted.
Sorry. I was wondering for the state map that you were showing us of downtown Nantucket, did you have that for 2030?
No, the only timeframes I have are present 2050 and 2070. They decided, for whatever reason in the MCFRM, not to use the state's 2030 in their modeling and going straight for 2050. And I know that they're developing 2100 as well. I don't know if they're developing 2030 or not, but it's a question that can be asked if we get someone from the state to explain it.
So I had 2 questions in one statement. And the first question, at our last meeting, we had the Steamship Authority guy, Bob Davis, talking about what they're doing over in Woods Hole, and all their resources are going toward that. And that maybe in 3 or 4 years, they have some sort of engineering for us for our terminal. And when we had the storm, it made me think about that more. That he said, well, maybe we're aiming to have something built for Nantucket in 10 years. And after seeing the photos you showed us, it makes me think that the Steamship Authority needs to be more forthcoming about what their plans are for us, because it may be a lot worse in just 10 years. And for us to plan and for the town to plan, we should be learning now, even their wildest crazy ideas, we should hear them, because our wildest crazy idea is a barrier in the harbor, which could actually happen. So what are they thinking? How can we plan for that if we don't know what they're thinking now? The other thing I wanted to say was the emissions that you were talking about, petering out at a certain time or continuing on or never stopping. Does the state figure in the release of methane from melting permafrost all over the world? Or is it, and do they also figure in that as I've read, about 30% of carbon emissions come from peat bogs? And so are we just talking about emissions generated by humans, or is this the big picture for emissions? That's it.
Those are big questions, Peter. Vince, I don't know if you have anything to offer there.
So the graph at the end just puts it in as CO2 equivalent per parts per million. I would have to go and do some serious reading to try and figure out if the other things are included. I can do.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, if we can get someone from the state from that program to give us some of those details, that would be great.
Oh, and I just had one other quick question, which was how often are they updating their data, the state, for this?
They haven't said yet. It's that new. They don't know. But to be quite frank, if they haven't got 2100 ready for us, they're not quite finished. So what about an update? I don't know.
All right, thanks, Vince.
Yeah, Vince, you had some, I won't say knowledge, but some speculation about when NOAA is going to update their data. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I've heard I could only call it a rumor at this point, mentions in newsletters would be probably a politer way of putting it, that they're expecting an update in 2022. So this year, maybe next year, but that was information I got more than a year ago.
Yeah, so that's part of our challenge, is the frequency of updates. You know, we don't want to keep ping-ponging back and forth as, you know, year after year as incremental things come out, you know, unless they're significant. You know, we don't really know how that's going to play out, but it's something to think about. Matt, please go ahead with your question.
No, I think my comment was, I agree with you, Mary. I think there's nothing wrong with bifurcating this and using the mass MCFRM, use that for planning purposes for town, but keep the public based on NOAA. I don't see, and then only move to that for public when it becomes public. I think that's probably the smartest way to go, so people are not confused. The other question I had, Vince, was how does this look at, you know, sort of water table rise and expansions of wetlands? Do they take those into account when they're, you know, in those? I'm getting a no from Jen.
And I'm going to agree with Jen, basically. As far as I know, it's not. Yeah, I know groundwater rise is an upcoming question. It really is, but Jen will have better information than me on this. I think is it something like is it a rule of thumb that it's a 25% match, roughly speaking. If you get like a foot of sea level rise, you get a quarter of that for groundwater level rise. And it's not even a solid rule of thumb. It's just a rule of thumb that changes depending on where the existing water table is, and I don't know, the composition of the soil, bedrock, that kind of stuff. It's very variable.
Right.
I would go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Yeah, and the reason I brought that up is, you know, we're talking about the landfill, and I'm trying to have those discussions. At some point, I would like this committee to, you know, and maybe our consultants to help us figure out what will be happening there, what should we be worried about, because I felt as though I'm not sure that those things are being taken into consideration. And I think the wetlands there, my gut said, you know, that was, you know, Jeremy's swamp. And my gut is that's going to be Jeremy's bog. My gut is that's going to expand, and it's going to want to expand, you know, all around the landfill. And so I wonder sort of, you know, anyway, I think it all has to be taken in, because otherwise I think this could be used to be like, well, see, that won't be an issue. The blue lines don't hit there. You know, they're not hitting the landfill. They're not hitting the hill. So we're fine. And I'm not so sure. And I know that's not what Vince feels, but I think that's sort of somehow how this is used. So I just think going forward, we have to make sure that we include other things that may be impactful as well.
I think, Matt, that's good to point out some of the challenges we have. Sea level rise is just one piece. You know, erosion is another piece. Additional rainfall is another piece. So there are, you know, many things to consider when planning that are environmental factors. Sea level is just one of them, unfortunately. Ian, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Mary. So Vince, can you, I've just sent you a link to the NSIDC data for Greenland and Antarctica. Can you post that? Can you put that up on the screen? Anyway, so I agree with everything that my fellow commissioners have said, and I think it would be a mistake to rely solely on the Massachusetts data. And I think I would not be alone in saying that I've noticed how various state departments succumb to or are influenced by political pressure. To give you an inkling, when you look at this graph and you look at the extent of Greenland ice level melt, you can see it's nearly tripled since 2000. And if you'd be kind enough to go down to the bottom there for Antarctica, it's exactly the same. And there are so many factors that aren't being taken into account, would be my guess in this, that I think it would be a singular mistake to depend solely on the mass data, and that we should absolutely keep the NOAA data in. This is actually NASA data, but thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Vince, if you'll forward that link to members of the commission, and we'll include that in the minutes as well. Fritz?
Yes, can you hear me?
Thank you, Vince.
Yeah. I've got a sort of a question and then a kind of a statement, or not a statement, but a point I want to try to make. We're spending a great deal of time talking about projected sea level rise, obviously. We did that in our recommendation, which the select board adopted. We now have, it's been addressed in the Coastal Resilience Plan, which the town has adopted. But I guess the question I've got is, do we have any evidence that anybody is paying attention or using these projections in any current planning? That's the question first, and then I kind of want to move on from there.
Vince?
So
that's a rhetorical question that I can move on. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. I'm trying to make a point. So maybe that's a rhetorical question unless somebody has an answer to it.
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
So, I worked with the DPW, Planning and Land Use Service, I think Harbour Master as well, on various projects that are coming up where they wanted to include the town recommendation. So there's a handful of town departments. Oh, and town admin, sorry, town admin was another one, where they've included the recommendation as being used. And I am having a meeting tomorrow with the sewer department where I'm going to be pushing it with them as well, because it is the current one in force. Sorry, I should have said that in the list. But yes, basically I've been, I don't want to say watchdogging this, but I've been keeping an eye, and departments have been approaching me with requests. But it's been town departments for the most part, because we can't really apply it to the general public as such or easily, but we can certainly apply it for town developments, and we have done.
Okay, here's my the point that I'm trying to make. That I want to make is, as Gary mentioned a few minutes ago, the planning board has before it now a development development for a 29 guest bedroom guest house and pool at 6 to 8 North Beach Street, including 3 buildings that would all be renovated. The applicant came in and initially was asking for us to give them a waiver of even presenting a drainage plan, which we rejected, and we're requiring them to come up with that. And their plan is, the engineer said that they were planning on doing whatever they needed to do to raise the buildings to meet current building code standards, which is based on NOAA present flood hazard data. So we just saw the map for Brant Point in that area, which shows that there'll be significant flooding in the next 30 years. I think it was it 2030 or 2050 that you showed that? 2050?
50. Yeah,
2050. So my concern is this, that we're making this, but certainly as to building code and planning board, there's no discussion of sea level rise in any significant way other than a few of us mentioning it at the planning board level, the planning department, or the Planning and Economic Development Commission. And that concerns me because if we're not building, it's a little like Matt's comment about why are we building sewers to Mattocket if a lot of Mattocket may be lost eventually to the ocean. And so I'm concerned that we have all of this, but that people who are building presently, like this particular developer, I'm not even sure whether they're aware of the recommendations. I ask for the coming meeting that's coming up on Monday, that the engineer and the applicant address how their plans would further the coastal resilience plan or take into account the coastal resilience plan. Because I guess we don't have any way of mandating that they do that. I suppose the board could, in setting conditions, could take it into account. But I don't think at the planning board level, there's really any significant understanding of really what we're doing. And it concerns me. So I don't know what role we as a committee have in trying to do anything, but other than in this particular case, other than me just raising questions and asking, here's a significant, and I'm not throwing them under the bus, I'm just using them as a current example. There are probably many others, but just happens to be the current example. And specifically, as Gary pointed out, I want to put it in a swimming pool. So it's just, it bothers me. And so I'd be curious to hear what anybody else thinks or feels about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fritz. Vince?
Yeah, so Fritz hits an interesting point, and it's something we have to try and figure out. There's kind of two ways to try and explain this, I suppose. Thanks, Morgan. There's only one regulatory map for flood zones at the moment, and that's the FEMA flood zones map. It's the FIRMS map. That's all anyone actually has to go by. So then I'm going to go back to the start when we were chatting about this recommendation, or sorry, when the committee was chatting about this recommendation 2 years ago. The idea was that, we'd have a recommendation in place that would become used by the town, then get broader use at some point after that. Are we at that point yet? I don't know. But at some point, it would end up being the foundation for what might be a town bylaw, for the sake of argument, to deal with sea level rise. At the moment, sea level rise isn't on any town book or statute or state level for that matter, so no one has to pay attention to it. And I really feel for Fritz's point when he's talking about people talking about putting a pool in on Easton Street or whatever and not taking account of sea level rise. But the harsh reality is nobody has to take account of it yet. And it's what level of risk is acceptable to the person during the development. And that's something we can't change today, but we can certainly start the conversation on how could we change that for the future. So at the moment, they're talking about putting a pool in a flood zone, not taking any account of sea level rise, but there's no need for them to, because there's no requirement, I suppose, is what I actually mean. There's no legal requirement. And that's the point Fritz is getting to, I think. We need to start working on that framework. I don't know how that would work yet. Nantucket would be something of a leader if we got that far. Again.
Thank you, Fritz. Fritz, did you have anything else? Or?
No.
No, okay. Jen, go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Mary. I think Fritz's question is really good. So if there's more, my comments were from a while ago, so I can put them out there, but if there's more discussion about what he brought up, I think it'd be good to circle back to that, because that's kind of really the crux of, I don't know how we move forward with development on this island. I put my hand up because I had comments for one of the questions Peter was asking, and then about the groundwater. Peter was asking about those carbon projection scenarios, the RCPs. Those actually come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the RCP is developed at global and regional and local scales. And it's complicated. And when I read it, it kind of turns me in circles to figure out all the data that's in there, but they're projections basically on CO2 emissions that take everything into account, both natural and human action. And they actually were just updated in 2021, but they get updated every 5 years. So looking at the Massachusetts stuff, they're taking data from a couple places that get updated at a couple times a year. So that adds to that complexity of how recent the data is that's being built into that model. Just thinking about that as a complication. And then Matt, to your question on the groundwater, nobody knows yet. the work to model groundwater rise is just starting in places. There was a consultant group that did it for some areas on Cape Cod just recently, but none of the islands weren't included in that work. So people are starting to model what groundwater rise is going to look like with sea level rise, but we just don't have the data yet. It doesn't exist yet. So it's one of those gaps in knowledge that we are going to need sooner rather than later, especially thinking about places like Brant Point. And if you put a swimming pool in there, I mean, groundwater rise out there is one of the biggest issues we're going to have to deal with immediately. But those are my 2 comments, just informational.
Thank you, Jen. So I want to repeat, this is the beginning of this discussion, and there's certainly a lot to take in. So I want to make sure that we move on to the other items in the agenda. But any last thoughts from committee members, something that hasn't been said? Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with what Fritz is saying. I watch so many of the regulatory meetings that are occurring these days, and no one, it is so rare for anyone to hear a discussion about what about the issues raised by the crack plans and the coastal resiliency plan. It's just terrible. And if we wait for what Vince said before was that, yes, the town is thinking about it, that's not good enough for me. It shouldn't be good enough for us. Of course, all of the development is happening through private individuals on the island. And here we have a directive from the select board. These are the folks who are trying to protect our island. They give a directive for every regulatory agency on the island to make sure that these considerations are taken up by them in their discussions and deliberations, and no one seems to be applying it. And I don't know why shouldn't these regulatory boards just say no, just say sorry, based on what we see and based on what we're told to do. We have a directive from the select board. We have to take into consideration the reality. This weekend, by the way, or last weekend, should be a big help to us because people were coming face to face with what they may be dealing with several years from now. And maybe they'll be a little more serious about that. But I think we have to have somebody, if we wait for FEMA regulations to be changed, the island will be so further developed in places where it shouldn't be developed that our efforts will be for naught. Very frustrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Peter, last comment.
Okay, so when we first were formed as a committee, we got right on top of developing a message that would go to the regulatory boards and say, hey, we're doing this, and you guys need to make your applicants aware that these recommendations should be applied to the applicants that come in. And so now here we are, we have the plan. Maybe it's time, I don't know if this is possible for us to strengthen that and come up with specifics to give to the regulatory boards. I don't know if that's possible, but, and then I wanted to say that no matter what we come up with, the developers are out for money for development. You know, they're gonna do the best they can to get around it. Like Fritz said, you know, trying to seek a waiver to not do a drainage plan. You know, it's gonna take a lot more than just us saying, hey, if you don't mind, could you not do a pool? Could you not build there? It's gonna take actual regulations. We're gonna have to make changes at town meeting, amend bylaws. So I don't know if that's our purview, but you know, we should get going on it if we can.
So I think that, and my understanding may not be perfect on this, but the point of a regulatory board is to enforce regulations. And right now we don't have regulations, but that is one of the recommendations of the Coastal Resilience Plan that the town, when I say we, I mean the town, consider regulations that could then be enforced. So Vince, if I've gone off track on that, you know, correct me, but.
That's correct. Okay. The only thing that I would add to it is the current standing recommendation is only in place until the CRP design flood regulations can be implemented. If we can't take in the MCFRM and the design flood elevations that it's tied to, at least in a bifurcated fashion, like yourself and Matt were suggesting. We're going to be delaying on that recommendation for a while. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just making everyone aware.
Thanks, Vince. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is a grant application discussion and update from Vince. So this is just, again, to familiarize the committee with what is going on. I don't think you have any announcements, Vince, but let us know how it's going.
Yeah, okay. So I brought it up on the 25th, at the January 25th meeting. I have started the process of getting letters of interest out there for a handful of grants. I've got the letter of interest in for the MVP grant. We won't know how that's going to go. It's just early registration for letter of interest. It gets extra points, that kind of thing. And the important thing is we got to wait until March, probably the end of March, when they're going to put out their RFR, request for responses. So then at that point, we'll progress with the grant writing that we've already discussed with here previously with Arcadis. I've also put in another letter of interest for a different grant program. This is big. I don't know what our chances are. I'm just going to tell people about it. I will keep people updated as I get information, but we won't know for quite some time. It's through the BRIC grants. It's called DTA, Direct Technical Assistance. I put in a letter of interest for that. That will get us more grant writing ability and to push forward on some of our more major projects in the CRP and HMP as well, by the way. This is through FEMA because it's through BRIC. It's substantially large and it's somewhat kind of aimed indirectly at communities that have great need, particularly economically disadvantaged communities, but it's open to any community. So I applied for it anyway, but just letting people know about it. So hopefully direct technical assistance might be something that might work. We'd get a benefit from that for 3 years, up to 3 years potentially, to get that kind of assistance from BRIC. There's another one that...
what is BRIC, if you remember?
Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC.
And that was a 2021 federal program that was passed?
Correct.
Yeah, great, thanks.
And it's it came from this sections of the DTA came from a White House request to FEMA for disadvantaged areas. There's another one that I'm looking at the moment that's really interesting. I'm trying to read a lot about it. Would accept any help from the committee on this one, please. It's got a wonderful acronym, RAISE, R-A-I-S-E. Rebuilding American Infrastructure and Sustainability and Equity, with sustainability and equity. It's something that I'd be quite interested in, but there's a lot to this grant as well. It would probably require a team of people to administer if we ever got it. But these are the ones that I've the first two are the ones that I've already got letters of interest in for, and we won't see anything back from those for quite some time. Grant requests take a long time, quite frankly, particularly once you get up to the federal level. The RAISE one, I would happily take committee help with, please. And if anyone comes across any other grants that they think might be applicable, please, please, please send them along. It's going to be my perpetual request. I'm always trying to find grant sourcing.
Great, thank you, Vince. Any questions or comments from committee members? Well, keep up the good work, I guess, is all we need to say there. So we want to pause for public comments on any of the topics we've discussed today or on other topics not on the agenda. Bruce Mandel, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I guess to partially address Fritz McClure's comments and to make my comments, the draft CRP has recently taken on a broader context as we consider plans to SOAR parts of Mattocket and the associated density impact issues. And there's an engineer's estimate cost of $50 million for that project. Recent concerns expressed by a few town officials about clearly needed added costs to that cost estimate to address the effects of sea level rise, coastal erosion, title caused inaccessibility to the West End, whether and how to protect the West End infrastructure, the landfill, are now entering this discussion, in part using the draft CRP as a basis for these discussions. Therefore, the previously submitted lists of comments and suggestions that I sent to the committee in October and November regarding the omissions and the basis for certain assumptions about the West End's specific elements of the draft CRP, which have gone unaddressed, take on an impactful and potential costly effect. During our correspondence about these comments and suggestions, some members of the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee expressed that in the past, these comments were worthy of consideration and discussion with the authors. We were promised a one-on-one stakeholder type discussion with the authors of the draft document, where our documentation might be reviewed and perhaps used to strengthen the CRP. That hasn't happened. Now, I'm making these comments because the consultant's contract has been extended a little bit to allow time to finalize the CRP. And we're once again requesting the opportunity for a timely, informed consideration of the issues previously shared but not discussed, including a reasonable chance for a one-on-one conversation with the authors about the importance of the issues that we previously shared. And I'd like to know if there is an opportunity to address this. The CRP is becoming a much more useful document for many issues, and a very expensive West End sewer project is being proposed that lacks consideration for some of the items in the CRP. I think we need an opportunity to address these. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Bruce. I will note that it is not a draft CRP. The CRP is final. It has been adopted by the select board. It is done. And as I wrote back to you in an email, the extension of the contract is specific to the grant writing opportunity that Arcadis is assisting us with. That the time needed to participate through the entire grant process was the reason for the extension. Vince, did you have additional comments?
The only thing I want to say is...
That's right, Bruce, I recognize Vince. We'll get back to you in a minute.
Bruce made specific point about the documentation he sent to be reviewed with his concerns and neighbors' concerns. They were reviewed by Arcadis at the time, is my memory of it. And it was conflating issues and we couldn't understand it. So we thought it was all well addressed and well understood. And we had trouble understanding the point of the concern. We couldn't see the point of it or the need for a one-on-one other than the request for one. We couldn't see the point of the meeting.
All right, thank you, Vince. Bruce, I want to add that part of the mission of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is to continue after the adoption of the plan with recommendations for implementation of the recommendations in the CRP. And Mattakit has a very high percentage of high priority recommendations, and I certainly would expect to be convening another meeting focused on those recommendations. So there will be another opportunity for us to talk to members of the Mattakit community. Bruce, additional comments?
Only thank you for those comments. And Vince, I'm sorry that you guys didn't understand it, but you also didn't reach out to sit down for us to help try to explain them. At any rate, with a final CRP being used for major decisions, there certainly ought to be an opportunity to address flaws and omissions that could affect decisions. And of course, I'm focusing on the West End and a potentially very expensive project. So if there becomes an opportunity to review the final draft in that context, I think we would welcome that, and I appreciate it.
Just noting again, it is not a draft, it is final. It is not subject to review in the current time frame. It would come up for review in approximately 5 years, as most plans do. Vince, 10 years, Vince is saying. Thank you, Vince.
By that time, some serious omissions and some assumptions will have affected how sea level rise, infrastructure availability, and the impact on things like the landfill are adversely affect. And I think 10 years, I probably won't be around, but it's unfortunate.
Well, we hope you will, Bruce. But certainly there will be a lot more information and impact across the island in 10 years. Any further questions or comments from the public? I am not seeing any. So we'll move on to approval of the minutes. So the presentation that we had on January 25th from Chuck Larson on the flooding in Easy Street, I was really impressed by the presentation and dug into some of the links and discovered that unfortunately one of the slides was mislabeled. Chuck confirmed that, and he has provided an updated presentation. As far as the minutes go, we can't swap out a presentation that's been changed for the presentation that existed, that was given and is available for the recording. So Vince, if you would put the minutes up on the screen. The other thing that I want to mention is, because I did dig into that presentation so much, I wanted the minutes to reflect more of the information for the public, and in particular, taking Chuck's advice into account that, you know, the information is very complex, and there are a lot of pieces of each scenario that was provided. So I tried to provide some of the more specific descriptions of the scenario in the minutes. So keeping all that in mind, so we had some minor corrections at the beginning. Morgan Sale, no S on the end of her name, adding Chuck Larson as staff present. Vince added the link to the meeting. So if we want to scroll down to discussion item 1 in the minutes. So Vince, you sent these out to all the committee members, is that correct, Vince? No, you haven't. Okay, so this has not been seen yet. So what I tried to do was provide clarification onto the minutes that Pritz provided, and to provide some of the additional information that gave a better understanding for someone who would be reading the minutes and potentially not watching the recording. So I will take suggestions from the committee as to how we should proceed. I apologize, I didn't realize that no one had seen this yet. It does make it difficult to review on the screen and in this context.
Sorry, Mary, this might be my fault. I was trying to explain that via email during the week. I probably just didn't explain it correctly. We take in the corrections during the meeting, and then we don't actually, if people want to take time to read this, and we can approve it at the next meeting instead. That was the point I was trying to make.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, that's where I think we need to end up. But what is the pleasure of the committee members? Vince? Ian, and then we'll get back to Vince.
Sorry, Mary. So yes, definitely I'd like to. Now you see me, now you don't.
Yes.
At the next meeting, please. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments? All right, Vince, go ahead.
Just any other comments or corrections or updates that committee members noticed?
Just the misspelling of Morgan's name.
Yeah, it's already done.
Yeah. And at the end as well.
Okay.
Yeah, at the beginning of the storm update. I'm not familiar with how appropriate it is to put a note on the minutes, but I did want to make sure that the public had correct information. So I put the note, sorry, I did not put, where did, oh, I put it on our agenda. Is it appropriate for the note that is written on the agenda about the error being discovered to be added to the minutes of January 25th? Again, seeing a nod from Joanna.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So the minutes of January 5th, we will send out the expanded minutes that I wrote. We'll add the note that's right there on our agenda from today. And I think, what is the best way to proceed with Chuck's revised presentation? He not only changed the slide where there was an error, he updated some of the other slides to provide better clarity. Do we want to bring that back at a future meeting for review and discussion, or what's the best way to proceed with that?
I would have thought just to note it, Mary, would be sufficient.
Okay. So for the minutes for today's meeting, we will attach Chuck's revised presentation with the comment that it's been corrected and revised since the presentation on January 25th, if that suits everyone. Great. So may I have a motion to postpone the adoption of the minutes pending review until our next meeting? I think I want to go ahead and get that on the record officially.
So moved.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have a second?
Sure.
Thank you, Ian. Any discussion, further discussion? Roll call vote, Gary Beller.
Aye.
Sarah Boyce had to leave the meeting. Peter Brace.
Aye.
Matt Fee.
Aye.
Ian Golding.
Aye.
Jen Carberg.
Aye.
Fritz McClure.
Aye.
Joanna Roach.
Aye.
And Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you. Okay, new business. Do we have any further updates, Vince? Are you tired of talking to us? Anything else you want to say?
I'm just going to share screens so we can have the agenda up so people can see it.
Yeah.
Do you want to do the
yes. So I hope that everybody did see in the town manager's newsletter that came out, I think February 1st, she wrote a very sincere thank you to the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee for the work that we put into the Coastal Resilience Plan. So I wanted to make sure everybody received that message from her. And I really appreciate that. Vince, you have further updates?
Yes, thanks. Just getting to my notes. Okay, so Baxter Road is one of the updates that I have for today. It's going to be a question at CONCOM on this coming Thursday evening as to the workshop that's planned for February 17th. It's about the compliance plan and getting the existing structure back in compliance and a new operation and maintenance manual. We're still a different Baxter Road topic. We're still moving ahead with the other part of it, of the Baxter Road project, which is planning for road relocation. Oh, sorry, I should back up and for 1 second say one thing here. I don't think Ian was at the last meeting, and I wanted to make everyone aware. I don't want anything forgotten about or left behind. There were a couple of contracts approved in January. This is old news to some committee members, and I apologize, but have everyone up to date. There was an approval to move forward with an NOI application, and I've been asked to be the project manager on that one. And then there was a second one to look at road relocation. There's 3 people working on that. It's myself, Libby Gibson, and Ken Bogrant. So that's such a big project, and that's going to take quite some time. The timing for each of them, just so everyone knows, is the NOI is probably going to have to wait until after the operation and maintenance gets sorted out and the compliance plan put in place so that we can move forward with that as the case may be. And then the road relocation, that's probably 1.5 years of a project, I should think. I'm not really 100% sure, to be honest. I just want to stop there. I know Ian might have questions or not, I don't know.
Ian, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
No, I don't. And thank you for bringing us all up to date, or bringing me up to date, Vince.
No worries. So then after Baxter Road, the other thing that I want to say is, I think it was January 27th, I went to FinCom and I had a presentation to give to that committee. I was asked to give about a 20-25 minute presentation with time for questions afterwards. I fully admit that I went way over my 20-25 minutes, and I think I spoke for about 40 something minutes. And then the discussion went on with questions after that. It was a terrific presentation, and I think there's a link in the minutes. Yes. Yeah, sorry, it's the agenda.
Yeah, I attended that presentation, and it was a terrific presentation. It was very focused, but got a lot of information in there.
And the next point in the agenda, Mary, we had asked Jen if she was willing to speak on it.
So Jen, congratulations on that virtual tour release. Why don't you tell us more about that and how it can be used for coastal resilience planning?
Sure, thank you, Mary. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation and the trustees partnered together over the last year to launch we call it, it's a 360 virtual tour of the Coatue Cosqueda properties out on the refuge. The idea is to bring people out to the refuge and through their computer screens in a digital way to be able to hop around and explore areas on the refuge where they learn about the ecology of the space, the history of the space, information like that. It really is just an informational tool. I think the link is there in the agenda if you want to go look at it. It involved drone flights over the entire property, and then staff and board members of both organizations kind of coming in at key spots. We called them nodes, I guess, but key areas where we talked about specific things that you might encounter there, or what you might see. And again, it's really just informational. It's to help explore the property and show people what's out there. And there certainly is discussion about sea level rise and access and changes that we're seeing out on the property out there. So it's fun if you want to go bop around and take a look at it. I'll also send Vince a link for this, but as part of this kind of educational piece that the two organizations are doing together, we also recorded 2 podcasts with America Adapts, which if you haven't checked out the America Adapts podcast, it's really useful. It's really interesting. It's all about climate change, coastal resiliency, et cetera. But we had 2 specific episodes of it that were hosted by NCF and T2R, where we discussed Coatue and the history on Coatue and changes on Coatue and that kind of thing. I haven't listened to the one that I'm actually on yet, so I don't know how good it is, but the first one was really good. Didn't really want to listen to my own voice talking, but they're really informative and interesting and a lot of different perspectives. But again, it's just educational.
Vince, we are still seeing your screen, so we're seeing you browse to that site.
I can send that link and then you can share it later. It's on the NCF website as well, but I can share that.
So I kind of wanted people to see that, Mary.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure we all knew where we were going. So Jen, thank you for that. I think it's wonderful because it documents existing conditions, and we may be able to use that as a reference point for seeing future change. So that will be very interesting to have. It's an incredible overall view of the area at a point in time. Any other comments or updates from committee members from their respective committees that they represent? Peter?
Yes. One thing the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board has been keen to get a hold of is the town's developing dredging plan, which Jeff Carlson tells us is coming up a lot sooner. He's going to have a draft for us maybe by springtime. I don't know what bearing that has on us on this committee, but for us, it's a big deal because we've been exploring a possible pilot project where we would hopefully get the town to do a micro dredging of eelgrass beds to remove sand that's built up over time. So we're waiting for that, and then I guess we'll act. So.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to this committee to know how the town is planning to use the materials that are removed, what projects they're going toward, and hopefully for Coastal Resilience purposes. Other comments, committee members? Okay, so finally, discussion of upcoming meeting dates and topics. So just to repeat, as I frequently do, we welcome suggestions for upcoming meeting topics and guest speakers. We've mentioned a few possibilities today. We'll certainly be following up on those. And I'm always happy to have suggestions from committee members. If there's nothing else, we can take a motion to adjourn.
What's the next date for the next meeting?
Oh, next meeting is February 22nd. So second and fourth Tuesdays of the month.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Peter. Roll call vote. Carrie Beller.
Aye.
Peter Brace.
Aye.
Matt Fee.
Aye.
Ian Golding.
Aye.
Jen Carberg.
Aye.
Fritz McClure.
Aye.
And Mary Longacre, aye. Joanna Roach left the meeting at about 11:40, right before we adjourned. Fritz, for the minute, Sarah Boyce left the meeting about 10:55.
Thank you.
Well, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Vince, are you there?
Yep, just going to stop the recording 1 moment.
Yeah.